Hi, it's great to see you. It's great to see you here today. I just want to tell you, let's talk about the first time we met. You had come up to me, introduced yourself, and you did it in sign language, American Sign Language. I don't know if you realized how rare of an occurrence that was. And how did you learn sign? How did you learn ASL, and what made you feel comfortable enough to approach me and want to interact with me?
Well, I learned ASL over 20 years ago, maybe almost 25 years ago, from a woman that I dated for a long time who was deaf and who taught me how to sign and allowed me to interact with her and other people in the deaf community.
Yes, and I do hope you realize how much of an impact that had on me. It was honestly where we began our relationship. Just the fact that myself, working in state government and seeing hearing leaders, non-deaf leaders, and seeing them feel initiative like yourself, taking that initiative to communicate, that meant more than you probably realize. And that's one of those things that I do wish more non-deaf and hearing people understood about the deaf community. Just because we communicate in a different way doesn't mean that you can't come up and talk to us, or approach us, or engage us in conversation. And we're people too. Just because we communicate differently doesn't mean that we don't deserve the same level of respect as a hearing, able-bodied individual. So I just want to again thank you for that, because honestly, that was an amazing moment for me. So do you mind telling me a bit more about your experience as far as interacting with the deaf community, people with disabilities? How has that impacted your work that you do?
Well, I think it's really important that as public officials that we take our experiences with various different communities of people and apply that to the work that we do to best know how to serve our state residents. And when I say that, of course, I mean all of our state residents, not just hearing people and not just able-bodied people, but everybody. I think my experiences with the deaf community were incredibly helpful to allow me to become a better public servant, because it has allowed me to see the shortcomings in terms of what we provide to the deaf community in terms of their ability to interact with their state government and their communities at large, and to do everything that I can to try to at least make things a little bit easier for people to be able to navigate their state government.
Right. I think that's one thing. If there's a hearing person who knows nothing about the deaf community, there's one thing that I would love for them to know. We live in a world that, we have to navigate a system that has been designed to benefit one group of people. So when our experience as far as barriers, inequities, we have to really, honestly, generally people with disabilities, we have to fine-tune our approach and adapt to every situation that we're thrown into. A good example for me would be every person that I meet, I have to think about, are they going to understand that I communicate differently to them? Are they going to understand me? And I might have an interpreter there. So the interpreter is just there to facilitate communication. Are they going to understand that I deserve this same level of respect as anyone else? So I think for me as the director and as a deaf person, I had to really ingrain that within my own self, that the community I'm serving is facing daily barriers. And we need to have integrity in our community relating to their level of education, their environments that they are in, where they work, what they do for a living, all of that. It's part of my job that I have to find ways to challenge the system, right? And draw attention to the barriers that we have, because we do have those issues. And let's bring to the table perspective. And with that perspective, shifting that culture and challenging yourself and having those hearing decision makers and changing their mindset and their attitude as far as how they view the deaf community, but also doing it in a way that I'm bringing solutions and trying to create a system change within the system. And to me, sometimes that's a struggle because I'm a deaf individual first, but I'm also a director. So I have to recognize that I am actually a part of this system. So in your work, I've noticed there's a lot of commonalities with that because you serve the public. And within that realm, you have to advocate for and understand that members of a group here might experience inequities because of the system. So in your relationships and in your work, how does that influence what you do?
Well, it allows me to see the challenges that the community faces and think about it in the scope of my work. So, for instance, it's only recently that I've started to notice that when statewide elected officials, for instance, do interviews or give press conferences, that there's an interpreter there so that the deaf and hard of hearing community is able to follow. It's especially important during the time of COVID. I mean, these are emergency circumstances, and all of the public needs to have that information, not just people who can hear that. But it goes to everything, right? So when we do videos that we post online, we do that all the time now as a way to communicate with the public. They need to be closed captioned every time. We need to make sure that's happening. I was approached by Representative Matt Kolazar, who's actually my state rep, and I know his wife very well, and both of her parents are deaf. And it had never occurred to me before that when they broadcast State House and Senate hearings, there's no closed caption. So, how is a person who's deaf able to follow along and know what their state government is doing? Deaf people deserve to know what the government is doing just as much as everybody else. And we have the tools to be able to assist. It's just oftentimes we don't use them. And I think about sometimes just the everyday interactions that people have to have with their government. And I mean, whether you're renewing your license at the Secretary of State's office, whether you're applying for, unemployment insurance benefits, I mean, everything down the line, everything is a greater challenge for people who are deaf, and we have to make sure that those accommodations are made for people of all abilities to ensure that their government is serving them just the same way that it's serving everybody else.
And I agree with you.
Yes, I do agree with that. So we celebrated the 31st anniversary of the ADA recently, and there's been people that I've talked to lately. I've been promoting this idea of we need to go beyond the ADA. I mean, COVID really highlighted that need. Like you said, you see more interpreters on the stage, you see more captioning, you see more awareness, more highlighting about barriers with masks for that deaf and hard of hearing people experience with the mask coming on. And it's the increased awareness that is wonderful. However, we need to go beyond that. So when we're talking about equity, inclusion, and access, we need to shift our mindset. We have to embed it within the system. We can't just say, oh, it's a legal thing, this is compliance. It's more about doing the right thing and changing that mindset. So say if we can get more leadership, more decision makers to understand that and invest within the community, then the community will meet you halfway. They will. Because you're showing an investment in them, that you want to understand our barriers. And that we're not going to accommodate your needs before we have to think about our own. Because far too often we do that within the deaf community. We experience barriers where it's just, it's too much work to do that, to advocate for my rights. So instead, because I would have to spend more time educating the hearing decision maker about what I need than I would be actually getting the services that I need. So I think part of that has to do with the hearing decision makers and shifting their mindset and their attitude and their views. And that's the only way that we're going to create change if we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion by adding these factors in. And I think that's one of the awesome things about the Elder Abuse Task Force. We're finding opportunities to collaborate. We're finding opportunities to create change within the system, systemic change, and confronting the inequities in a way that we're not just ignoring them. We're actively taking it head on. What can we do to make this better and improve services? I think that's a critical point to highlight, and I hope that people who might see this discussion would understand that when we're talking about change and systemic change and mindset, that it requires just meeting the deaf community halfway.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so helpful to have you, for instance, on the Elder Abuse Task Force. There are so many issues that I think for hearing people, if you're not specifically thinking about the deaf community, you would never think of it all. So for instance, I remember the first time I was approached by someone who, told me about the issue of having a person who was potentially being abused or neglected, having a police officer even come in to take a report, but the only person who can communicate with the police is the guardian and not the ward. So how is the ward supposed to communicate that the guardian is abusing him or her when they can't, the only person who's interpreting for them is their own guardian, who might be the person who's committing the abuse? And what a problem that is. We had a case that we were able to assist and intervene in that I know you're aware of, where you had a man that was really wrongly under a guardianship, because when the interview occurred to see if he, had any issues that he needed not just assistance with, but that he really needed to have a guardian wholly take over all of his, medical decisions and his financial decisions, it turned out that there's just no interpreter. So they thought, oh, this guy can't take care of himself. And that wasn't it at all. It was that nobody bothered to try to really speak to him in a language that he knew. So how was he supposed to communicate that he could in fact take care of himself and that he didn't have any mental health issues that would prohibit him from being able to take care of himself? But how would they know that? They never even got an interpreter. And we see this issue again and again and again, and it's just simply a matter of sometimes very, very basic services that are needed and required and absolutely necessary. And I agree with you that we should go beyond the ADA, but a lot of this stuff really is covered by the ADA. And it's just that people are being non-compliant. I don't know what your feelings are as to whether or not we have a shortage of interpreters or not, and maybe that's part of the problem, or we're not providing people whether it's adult protective services or child protective services or police departments with the right equipment to be able to communicate. One of the things that I learned from my experiences with the deaf community is that there were a lot of deaf people that could not, they didn't write in English the way that other people wrote in English. It was more of a sort of a disjointed type of communication. So it didn't parrot, it didn't mimic exactly how you would write it in English if you were a person that was educated in ASL but not educated in writing and reading English. And so that's a problem even with the current technology. You really have to have people who understand ASL and are able to communicate with people, and there has to be better training for that. But that's something that, had I not known so many people in the community, I wouldn't have known that. And the other thing was learning how difficult it was for deaf people to get a basic education in the first place. We just take for granted the fact that we have public schools that hopefully teach people how to read and write, but not everybody can do that. If you are, some of the people I knew were really lucky. They might have gone to the Detroit Day School for the Deaf, or people who were able to go to Gallaudet. But very few deaf people, in my experience, have those kinds of opportunities. And, no matter how bright they are, they aren't provided with the skill sets that hearing people are, because those opportunities don't exist for them. And we have to do a better job of that.
Yes. Yes, it's true. That goes back to understanding, even though the deaf community is so small, we are so diverse within that small community. And recognizing that intersectionality within the community, that's critical. I'm talking to my experience, I'm speaking to my experience, and I'm privileged, right? I have an education, I have awesome family supports, I have a good group of peers who understand the same struggles that I face. And I have a wonderful, amazing job. But there's people within our community that don't have that type of experience or that level of privilege. So when we're talking about, like you mentioned, hearing decision makers or people that don't know the deaf culture or the barriers that deaf people experience, that can cause even more oppression. And that's part of my job as a director, to recognize this inequity and the gaps. I mean, it's not enough to just say, hey, we know that we have a problem. We know that we have a problem with hearing decision makers making assumptions that what works for a deaf person. And that applies in education, employment, the court system, doctors' offices, hospitals. So we have to shift that. And that comes with training, that comes with discussions like this, that comes with collaboration. And I think it's critical that we have more people like you engaging with the community and highlighting that you get it. Some of the experiences that we have with barriers aren't the normal experience that hearing people would have. That's one thing that I hope with my own experience and as the director, we need to elevate awareness about what the deaf community's needs are and how can we get there in a way that is everyone wins, everyone benefits. That we don't just look at deaf people as, oh, you're a person that is costing me or costing the system money, because then we have to pay for the interpreters and the interpreting services. We have to work harder to accommodate their needs, this deaf person's needs. Hey, we're people, we're humans too. We just communicate differently. I think that's part of the barrier, that the mindset of you're costing me money. They don't see the value in meeting us halfway.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of that as well with the COVID pandemic in terms of even providing interpreters at hospitals. And I've heard experience after experience of deaf people who have come in for treatment and there's no one there to explain to them what's going on. And I can't even imagine how scary that is to, to go into the hospital, have potentially a life-threatening illness, and to have no one there who can even talk to you about it and explain to you what's happening. We have to do better. We have to do better by the deaf community, and we have to make sure their needs are met so that we can serve everybody in this state.
Yes, I agree. I think it will also help to acknowledge the challenges that we have and working together to create solutions and then confronting those challenges. COVID, you are spot on. It highlighted so many inequities in such ways that people might not have realized prior to COVID. I mean, maybe they might have known, but it wasn't as blatant or obvious. For me, for instance, at masks. People wearing masks is a huge communication barrier but it is necessary for our health. But the facial expression, the body language, there's just so much of how you learn about a person is in their face. It's scary sometimes that when you think about it, the barriers that we have to go through. But again, people with disabilities, more often than not, know how to tune themselves based upon the environment that they're put in. And I'll be honest with you, that can be exhausting. It's exhausting sometimes because that's how the world is designed. So I'm hopeful that we can change that by guiding people in the right way, changing the mindset about how we can deal with policies, how we deal with looking at how you engage with members of the public. Is your policy and procedures inclusive? Are you open-minded and willing to engage with others, with other communities that might communicate differently than you? So that's part of what I'm hoping to do going forward. I hope I'm going to challenge all those mindsets and challenge the status quo in a way that things can get better for everyone.
Couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I so appreciate you perpetually bringing to our attention things that we wouldn't otherwise know, and challenges that the community is facing that we really need to tackle head on, and understanding that as a state government, we have to do better.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your time today. It was so great to see you.
Thank you for having me.